The groom publicly mocked and abandoned the black bride at the altar, but years later was shocked to see her on the cover of a magazine. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The grand hall shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, their crystals casting dancing reflections across the polished marble floors. Rows of chairs lined with white satin ribbons faced a raised platform adorned with cascading floral arrangements, roses, lilies, and orchids arranged meticulously in towering vases. At the center of it all stood the altar, a pristine white arch draped in delicate fabric and fairy lights, waiting to frame the perfect moment. Guests, dressed in elegant suits and flowing gowns, milled about, their voices humming like distant static as they exchanged pleasantries and expectations for the day's events. Everything about the scene spoke of grandeur, of money carefully spent to craft an atmosphere of timeless beauty. But, despite the beauty, the room buzzed with tension, an undercurrent that could only be felt by those who weren't blinded by the opulence. Amelia sat in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection. The full-length mirror showed a vision of beauty. Dark, glowing skin against the ivory silk of her gown, her hair styled in soft curls that framed her face perfectly. Her makeup highlighted her deep brown eyes, giving them a shimmer that matched the tears she refused to let fall. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the wedding band, testing its weight on her finger. It felt foreign, heavier than it should have. A knock on the door startled her, and her maid of honor, Sophie, poked her head in. "You look breathtaking," Sophie said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Amelia tried to smile. "Thanks." Sophie sat beside her and took her hands, noticing the tension in her grip. "You're going to be okay. You love him, and he loves you. That's what matters." Amelia nodded, but the doubt lingered. She could still hear the sharp tone of Danell's mother, Marilyn, from their first meeting. "She's not what we expected," Marilyn had said with forced politeness, her words cutting deeper than any outright insult. Amelia had brushed it off then, convincing herself that time and love would soften their edges. But their stares and whispers never softened. If anything, they sharpened. Marilyn's husband, Gary, wasn't any better. He rarely spoke directly to Amelia, addressing her instead through Danell or ignoring her presence altogether. Their disdain wasn't subtle, and Amelia had felt it in every glance, every tight-lipped smile. Sophie squeezed her hands. "Don't let them get to you today, okay? Today's about you and Danell." Amelia exhaled slowly and forced herself to nod. Sophie was right. Today was her day, or so it should have been. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Danell stood in front of his own mirror, straightening his tie for the third time. He looked the part of the perfect groom, tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a tailored black tuxedo. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation he couldn't quite shake. His best man, Eric, lounged on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Nervous?" "No," Danell replied quickly, almost too quickly. Eric smirked. "You sure? You've adjusted that tie so many times it's probably about to unravel." Danell dropped his hands and turned to face him. "I'm fine. It's just a big day." "Big day is right. Your mom's been buzzing all morning. I think she's more excited about this than you are." Danell's jaw tightened. "She just wants everything to be perfect." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, well, she definitely didn't sound excited about the bride last time we talked." Danell didn't answer. He'd spent the past year trying to ignore his parents' opinions, convincing himself that he was stronger than their judgment. But standing here, surrounded by reminders of his upbringing, the tailored suit, the designer cufflinks, the polished shoes, He felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. "It's your call, man," Eric said, sensing his unease. "You've got time to back out if this doesn't feel right." Danell glared at him. "I'm not backing out." "Good, because this wedding cost a fortune." Eric grinned, but Danell didn't return the smile. In the main hall, Marilyn and Gary moved through the crowd like royalty, exchanging pleasantries and ensuring everyone knew their son was about to marry beneath him. Marilyn adjusted her pearl necklace as she whispered to one of her friends. "She's pretty," the woman said, nodding toward the bridal suite. Marilyn pursed her lips. "She's adequate." Gary snorted quietly, sipping his whiskey. "Danell's young. He'll learn." The words hung in the air like a judgment passed, one that needed no further elaboration. Back in the bridal suite, Amelia stood and smoothed out her gown. The knock on the door came again, this time sharper. "It's time," the wedding planner announced. Sophie hugged her. "You're ready." But as Amelia followed the planner out of the room and into the hall, her heartbeat quickened. She spotted Marilyn and Gary near the altar, their eyes cold and measuring as they turned to look at her. Her gaze shifted to Danell, standing at the front, his expression unreadable. The music started, and Amelia took the first step down the aisle, feeling the weight of every gaze on her. She focused on Danell, searching his face for reassurance, but something about the set of his shoulders and the tightness of his jaw made her stomach churn. Her mind raced, replaying every red flag she had ignored. The comments about her background, the subtle corrections to her behavior, the times Danell had said, "Just let it go," when she'd confronted him about his parents' remarks. She reached the altar, her hands shaking as she placed them in his. The guests fell silent. The ceremony began. Amelia tried to focus on the words, but her ears buzzed. The priest's voice seemed distant, like a hum in the background. She glanced at Danell, who looked calm, almost too calm. "Do you, Danell, take Amelia to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The words cut through the haze. Danell opened his mouth and then paused. The silence stretched. Amelia's heart stopped. And in that moment, everything shattered. The silence that filled the hall was deafening. It lingered, heavy and suffocating, wrapping itself around Amelia like an invisible shroud. She stood at the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched Danell's. Her eyes were locked onto his, searching for an explanation, for some flicker of reassurance that this was just a pause, a moment of nerves that would pass. But there was no warmth in his gaze, no apology, no love. Danell's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again, as if he were trying to form words but couldn't. The priest, sensing the tension, offered a polite cough to break the spell. "It's a simple question," he prompted softly. "Do you, Danell, take Amelia to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Danell finally exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, and looked out at the crowd. The guests leaned forward in anticipation, their expressions ranging from curiosity to dread. Marilyn sat in the front row, her spine rigid and her lips curved in a tight, expectant smile. Gary shifted in his seat, arms crossed over his chest. And then Danell spoke. He paused, pulling his hands away from Amelia's. Her breath hitched. "I can't do this," he said. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Amelia froze, her body locking in place as if the words had turned her to stone. "What?" The word barely escaped her lips, a whisper that was swallowed by the murmurs spreading through the crowd. Danell didn't look at her. Instead, he turned to the audience as if addressing them, as though Amelia no longer existed. "Look, I know this is unexpected," he began, his voice louder now, more controlled. "But I've been thinking, and this just doesn't feel right." His words struck Amelia like a slap. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the whispers and gasps that filled the room. Danell continued, his tone shifting from regret to justification. "I mean, let's be honest," he said, gesturing toward her. "We're not exactly a perfect match. Everyone here knows it." The murmurs turned to hushed laughter in some corners of the room. Amelia's cheeks burned, but she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Danell shrugged as if trying to downplay the cruelty of his words. "She's a great girl, really," he said, sparing her a brief glance before looking away again. "But we're just too different. Different backgrounds, different lives. Honestly, I think we were both trying to prove something, and maybe that's not enough to build a marriage on." He was smiling now, an uneasy, almost apologetic smile, as if expecting the crowd to sympathize with him. Amelia's voice finally returned, though it was barely above a whisper. You think this is a joke?" Danell turned back to her, his expression shifting to something that resembled pity. "No, Amelia, I just think this isn't fair to either of us," he said. "You deserve someone who really gets you, someone who comes from the same world as you do." The words twisted like a knife. Amelia felt her knees weaken, but she steadied herself. She refused to fall apart in front of these people. Marilyn's voice cut through the murmurs. "Well, better to end it now than to drag it out, don't you think?" The laughter came again, this time louder, more confident. Marilyn's friends joined in, and soon the sound echoed through the hall, sharp and cruel. Amelia's vision blurred, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She looked at Danell, her voice steadier now, but edged with something sharper. "You knew," she said. "You knew this whole time, didn't you? That you weren't going to go through with this." Danell hesitated, then shrugged. "I didn't want to hurt you, Amelia." Her laugh was bitter, short, and sharp. "You didn't want to hurt me?" She shook her head, her voice rising. "You brought me here. You let me stand in front of all these people and believe that this was real, and you didn't want to hurt me?" The room fell silent again. Danell looked uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot as if searching for a way out. Amelia took a step back, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "You're right about one thing," she said. "We are different, but not in the way you think." She slipped the ring off her finger and pressed it into his palm. "You don't deserve me." Then she turned and walked down the aisle, her head held high. Each step echoed through the room, louder than the murmurs and whispers that followed. Sophie was waiting near the back of the hall. "Amelia, wait." But Amelia didn't stop. She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, where the sounds of laughter and voices faded behind her. She kept walking, even as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Back inside, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. The laughter died down as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Marilyn leaned toward Gary, whispering something with a smug smile, while Danell stood frozen at the altar, the ring still clutched in his hand. Eric approached him, clapping him on the back. "Well, that was dramatic," Eric said, grinning. "You're probably better off, though. I mean, let's be real. She didn't exactly fit in." Danell didn't respond. He was still staring at the doors where Amelia had disappeared. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. The reception was canceled, but guests lingered, drinking and gossiping about the scene they had just witnessed. Some sympathized with Danell, praising his courage for ending things before it was too late. Others whispered about Amelia, speculating on how she must feel, how humiliated she must be. But Amelia wasn't thinking about them anymore. As she walked away from the hall, the cold night air filling her lungs, she felt something stir inside her, something stronger than the shame and anger that threatened to consume her. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do next. All she knew was that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. And with that thought, she kept walking, leaving behind the laughter, the whispers, and the man who had never truly seen her. The night air clung to Amelia's skin like a second layer, cool and sharp against the heat rising in her chest. She didn't stop walking until the lights and echoes of laughter from the reception hall faded into the distance. Only then did she pause, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her. Her wedding dress, now a symbol of humiliation rather than joy, trailed along the sidewalk, its hem catching dirt and debris as she stumbled toward nowhere in particular. She found herself standing at a bus stop, the fluorescent glow of the streetlight flickering overhead. Her phone vibrated in her hand, but she ignored it. She already knew who it was. Sophie, probably panicking, trying to find her. Maybe even Danell, though the thought of hearing his voice made her stomach churn. She slid the phone into her purse and sat down on the cold metal bench, her fingers tracing the outline of the now empty spot where her ring had been. The bus arrived 20 minutes later, its brakes hissing as it pulled up. She climbed aboard, ignoring the curious looks from the driver and the handful of passengers scattered across the rows. She dropped a few crumpled bills into the fare box, not even sure if it was enough, and sank into a seat near the back. The bus rattled down dimly lit streets, and Amelia stared out the window, her reflection a ghostly blur against the passing lights. She thought of all the things she'd left behind. Her apartment, filled with boxes of wedding gifts and decorations she no longer wanted. The job she'd quit in anticipation of moving in with Danell. The life she'd thought they were going to build together. It was gone. All of it, crumbling into ash in a single moment. By the time the bus reached the outskirts of the city, Amelia's mind was made up. She wouldn't go back. Not to the apartment, not to Danell, and certainly not to the life she'd been so desperate to create. She stepped off at the last stop, a small terminal where buses sat idling, their engines humming softly in the darkness. She spotted a ticket counter and walked up to it, pulling out her wallet with shaking hands. "One ticket," she said, "wherever's leaving next." The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Moments later, Amelia had a ticket in hand and was boarding another bus, this time bound for a small town she'd never heard of. The ride was long, and by the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to rise. The town was quiet, its streets empty except for a few early risers opening their shops and sweeping the sidewalks. Amelia stepped off the bus and into a world that felt foreign, yet safe in its anonymity. Her first few days were a blur of cheap motel rooms and hastily filled-out job applications. She took the first job she was offered, cleaning rooms at a small inn, and spent her nights scouring online listings for apartments. She eventually settled on a tiny studio in an aging building with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. The rent was cheap, and it was hers. Life became a routine. She worked during the day, scrubbing toilets and changing sheets, then returned to her apartment to eat microwave dinners and collapse into bed. On weekends, she picked up extra shifts at a local diner, serving coffee and eggs to regulars who barely acknowledged her. But the nights were the hardest. When the noise of the day faded and she was left alone with her thoughts, the memories came rushing back. She replayed the ceremony over and over, dissecting every word Danell had said, every look she'd ignored in the months leading up to it. She hated herself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting him, for believing that love could erase everything else. One night, after an especially long shift, Amelia sat in her apartment staring at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Her hands were raw from scrubbing floors and dark circles framed her eyes. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "This isn't who I am," she whispered. The words lingered in the air, but there was no answer. The next morning, she woke up early and went to the library. She didn't know what she was looking for at first, just something to distract her from the ache in her chest. She wandered through the aisles until a flyer caught her eye. It advertised a local nonprofit that helped women rebuild their lives after abuse and hardship. She folded the flyer and slipped it into her pocket. It took another week before she finally called the number. She almost hung up when a voice answered, but something stopped her. She introduced herself, fumbling over her words as she tried to explain why she was calling. I need something more," she said finally. The woman on the other end of the line, Linda, didn't press for details. Instead, she invited Amelia to meet her at the office the next day. When Amelia arrived, she was surprised by how ordinary the building looked. Just a small storefront with a hand-painted sign that read Hope Center. Inside, it smelled of coffee and paper, and the walls were covered with photos of smiling women and children. Linda was older, with streaks of gray in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She listened as Amelia stumbled through her story, her voice breaking when she described the wedding. "It sounds like you've been carrying this alone," Linda said gently. Amelia nodded. "You don't have to anymore." Those words cracked something open inside her. She didn't cry, not then, but for the first time in weeks she felt like she could breathe. Linda offered her a volunteer position, and Amelia accepted without hesitation. She spent her evenings helping sort donations and organize events, slowly finding purpose in the work. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when she lay awake, wondering if Danell ever thought about her, if he regretted what he'd done. But those thoughts grew quieter as the days passed. One afternoon, as she packed boxes of supplies for an outreach event, Linda handed her a stack of pamphlets. "You should speak at the next meeting," she said. Amelia froze. "I'm not ready for that." "You're more ready than you think." Linda's words stayed with her, and the more Amelia thought about it, the more she realized Linda was right. The night of the meeting, Amelia stood in front of a room full of women, some younger, some older, all of them carrying their own scars. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, but her voice didn't break. "My name is Amelia," she began, "and I know what it feels like to be told you're not enough." The words poured out of her, raw and unfiltered. She told them about the wedding, about the humiliation, about starting over. And when she finished, the room erupted into applause. For the first time, Amelia didn't feel like a victim. She felt like someone who had survived, and survival, she realized, was only the beginning. Amelia stood in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, adjusting the second-hand blazer she had picked up from the thrift store. The fabric was slightly worn, but it fit well enough to look professional. She ran her hands down the sleeves, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles, and took a deep breath. Today marked a turning point, her first presentation at the Hope Center's community meeting. She had spent weeks preparing, rehearsing her words late at night when the apartment building was silent, her voice barely above a whisper. But now, staring at her reflection, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "You've got this. Proud of you." Amelia smiled softly and slipped the phone into her bag before heading out the door. The community center buzzed with energy when she arrived. Women filled the small hall, chatting quietly while volunteers set up chairs and tables. Amelia spotted Linda near the front, talking to a group of donors, but her eyes immediately found the banner hanging behind the podium. Empowerment through action. Her palms grew damp. She wiped them on her skirt and took her seat near the stage, trying to tune out the low hum of voices around her. When Linda introduced her, Amelia's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She stepped onto the stage, clutching the microphone like a lifeline, and faced the crowd. "My name is Amelia," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I didn't always believe I had the power to stand in front of people like this." The room fell silent. She let her words hang for a moment before continuing. "For a long time, I let other people define my worth. I thought if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, I could change the way they saw me. But I learned the hard way that no amount of love can make someone respect you if they've already decided you don't deserve it." Her eyes swept the room, catching glimpses of nodding heads and tear-filled eyes. She told them about the wedding, the humiliation, the laughter, the shame, and how she had walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back. "But that day didn't break me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It set me free." She spoke about her journey, starting over with no money, no plan, and no one to lean on. She described the long hours cleaning motel rooms, the nights spent wondering if she'd made a mistake by leaving. "But I kept going," she said, "because I knew I couldn't go back." By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet, applauding. Amelia felt the tension in her chest release as a wave of relief washed over her. She had done it. After the meeting, people approached her to share their own stories. Some hugged her, others simply thanked her for giving them hope. Linda pulled her aside as the crowd thinned out. "I told you," Linda said with a grin. "You're a natural." Amelia laughed, but there was a tremor in her voice. "I didn't think I could do it." Linda's expression softened. "You did more than just speak, Amelia. You inspired them. Don't forget that." Over the next few months, Amelia's role at the Hope Center expanded. She began leading workshops on self-confidence and financial independence. She organized fundraising events, spoke at schools, and helped launch programs for women who needed legal assistance. But it wasn't easy. The long hours took their toll, and there were nights when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her. She still doubted herself sometimes, especially when she faced resistance. There were donors who questioned whether she was the right face for the organization. They didn't say it outright, but Amelia could see it in their eyes, in the way they hesitated to shake her hand or avoided making eye contact. Linda noticed it too. "They'll come around," she said one evening after a meeting, "and if they don't, we'll find people who will." Amelia wanted to believe her, but the doubts lingered. She knew that no matter how much progress she made, there would always be people who saw her as an outsider. Then came the break she hadn't expected. A local news station contacted the Hope Center, asking to interview Amelia for a segment on women's empowerment. At first, she wanted to say no. The thought of putting herself out there, of exposing her story to an even larger audience, terrified her. But Linda wouldn't let her back down. "You've come this far," Linda said. "Don't stop now." The interview was nerve-wracking. Cameras, lights, and microphones made Amelia feel like she was under a microscope. But once she started talking, the nerves faded. She spoke with the same honesty and passion that had carried her through that first speech, and by the end, the reporter was visibly moved. When the segment aired, the response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the Hope Center, and Amelia's inbox filled with messages from women across the state who wanted to share their stories. Her face began appearing in local newspapers and magazines. She was invited to speak at larger events, and soon her name was being mentioned alongside established activists and public figures. But with success came new challenges. Amelia struggled to balance her growing responsibilities with the emotional toll of hearing so many stories of pain and survival. She often lay awake at night, haunted by the faces of the women who came to the center seeking help. One night, as she sat at her desk surrounded by paperwork, Linda stopped by her office. "You need to take a break," Linda said firmly. Amelia shook her head. "There's too much to do." "There will always be more to do," Linda said, "but you can't help anyone if you burn yourself out." Amelia hesitated, then sighed. "You're right." She took the weekend off, the first real break she'd had in months, and spent it hiking in the nearby hills. As she stood at the top of a trail, looking out over the town, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She had built something meaningful, and for the first time she believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. When she returned to work, she was more determined than ever. She expanded the center's outreach programs, partnered with other nonprofits, and started a mentorship program for young girls. But even as her accomplishments grew, Amelia knew her journey wasn't over. She hadn't thought about Danell in weeks, but his face flashed through her mind one night as she scrolled through emails. She wondered if he had seen her interview, or if he even cared. Shaking the thought away, Amelia turned off her phone and focused on the future. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by what she had done since. And there was still so much more to do. Daniel sat in the leather chair of his spacious office, the city skyline stretching out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room reeked of wealth, polished mahogany, modern art hanging on the walls, and shelves lined with books that he hadn't touched. A glass of whiskey rested on the edge of his desk, half empty, its amber liquid catching the light. He leaned back, loosening his tie, and staring at the email glowing on his computer screen. The subject line read, "Hope Center expands to statewide initiative." The attached article featured a photograph of Amelia. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, her expression more refined and confident. But those eyes, they were the same. The ones that had once looked up at him with so much trust, so much love. Now they stared out from the screen like she owned the world. Daniel's chest tightened. He closed the email, but the image lingered. "Mr. Walsh?" His assistant's voice broke the silence as she peeked into the office. "Your 2 o'clock is here." Daniel blinked, shaking off the haze. "Push it back." "Sir?" "Just reschedule it," he snapped. The assistant hesitated, then nodded and shut the door. Daniel pressed his fingers against his temples. This wasn't the first time Amelia had crept back into his mind, but it felt different today. Sharper, heavier. He opened the email again and read the article this time. Amelia Reed, founder and director of the Hope Center, has become a symbol of resilience and progress. Her organization's mission to support women overcoming adversity has reached new heights, securing major grants and expanding services across the state. He exhaled slowly, his eyes lingering on the words resilience and progress. His phone buzzed and he snatched it up. "Eric?" "Hey, man, what's up? Thought you'd be at the golf course by now." "Not today." Don't tell me you're still brooding over that wedding mess, Eric said, chuckling. Dude, it's been years. She's probably baking cookies somewhere in the suburbs by now. Danell hesitated. She's not. What? She's in the papers, Amelia. She started some kind of charity and… Eric cut him off with a groan. Wait, you're seriously still hung up on her? Look, you dodged a bullet, and you know it. Imagine what your life would be like right now if you'd married her. Danell rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of Eric's words, but hating how hollow they sounded. He'd told himself the same thing for years, that he'd made the right decision, that they were too different to ever work. But now, as he sat in his office surrounded by meaningless luxury, he wasn't so sure. The truth was, his life felt like it had been on autopilot ever since that day at the altar. He'd married someone else, Rachel, because it had seemed like the logical next step. She was beautiful, well-connected, and from the same social circle. His parents had approved immediately, and the wedding had been everything Amelia's wasn't. Calm, predictable, and free of controversy. But the marriage itself was suffocating. Rachel cared more about appearances than substance, spending her days managing decorators and personal trainers while he buried himself in work. They barely spoke anymore, and when they did, it was about things that didn't matter: renovations, vacations, social events. Danell took another sip of whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the ache in his chest. Later that evening, he found himself scrolling through Amelia's social media profiles. He had never unfollowed her, though he'd muted updates long ago to keep her out of sight. Now, as he scrolled through photos of fundraisers, community events, and awards ceremonies, he couldn't look away. There she was, surrounded by people who clearly adored her, smiling in ways he hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship. She looked fulfilled, whole. He didn't know what he had expected to find. Maybe signs of struggle or regret, some hint that her success was a facade. Instead, all he saw was strength. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Rachel slept beside him, oblivious. He thought about the day he left Amelia standing at the altar, about the look in her eyes when he broke her heart in front of everyone. He'd told himself then that it was the right choice, that it would save them both from a future filled with resentment and failure. But now, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Danell woke up earlier than usual and went into the kitchen. Rachel was already there, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. "You're up early," she said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, pouring himself a cup. Rachel finally glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "You seem off. What's going on?" He hesitated. "I saw something about Amelia yesterday." Rachel's expression hardened instantly. "You're kidding." "It was an article. Her charity's doing really well." Rachel set down her mug with a sharp clink. "So what? You want me to feel bad for her? She's the one who didn't belong, Danell. Your parents were right." "Were they?" His voice was sharper than he intended, and Rachel blinked in surprise. "Yes, they were," she said, recovering quickly. "Look at your life. You have everything you could want. What more do you need?" Danell didn't answer. He left the kitchen and went straight to his office, where he sat down and stared at the framed wedding photo on his desk. It wasn't Amelia in the picture. It was Rachel, smiling radiantly as if the world belonged to her. He turned the frame face down. By midday, he couldn't resist. He drafted an email to Amelia. It took him nearly an hour to write, deleting and rewriting each sentence until it felt perfect, or as close to perfect as it could be. "Amelia, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I had to reach out. I saw your article and wanted to say congratulations. You've built something incredible. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. I know it's too late to fix it, but I needed to say it anyway. Daniel." He hovered over the send button, his finger trembling. Then he pressed it and immediately regretted it. Days passed with no reply. Daniel checked his inbox obsessively, each time finding it empty. Then, late one evening, her response arrived. "Daniel, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the kind words. I've moved on, and I hope you have too. Best, Amelia." He read the email over and over, trying to find something hidden between the lines, but there was nothing. It was polite, distant, exactly the kind of response he should have expected, but it wasn't enough. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the full weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had let Amelia go, convinced it was for the best. Now, as he stared at her words, he realized he might have let go of the one thing that ever made him feel whole. Daniel sat at his desk, the soft hum of the city barely audible through the thick windows of his office. The email from Amelia lingered in his inbox, haunting him. He had read it so many times that he could recite it word for word. The politeness, the distance. It was worse than anger. It was indifference. He closed his laptop, but her words echoed in his mind. "I've moved on, and I hope you have too." Had he? The glass of whiskey in his hand trembled slightly as he raised it to his lips. He told himself it was just frustration, not regret. But deep down, he knew better. That night, he couldn't sleep. The city lights outside his window cast long shadows across the walls, and his thoughts spiraled. He pictured her face, how she had looked at the altar, how her eyes had searched his for answers he refused to give. He imagined her now, standing confidently at a podium, inspiring rooms full of people. Was it possible she had truly erased him from her life? Daniel grabbed his phone and began searching for more about her. News articles, interviews, and social media profiles painted a vivid picture of Amelia's success. She had transformed her pain into purpose, becoming a voice for the voiceless. And what had he done? Built a business empire? Married someone who looked perfect in photographs but felt like a stranger in their own home? He needed to see her again. 2 weeks later, he found his chance. Amelia was scheduled to speak at a charity gala in the city. It was an exclusive event. Tables filled with CEOs, socialites, and philanthropists. The kind of crowd Daniel knew well. He pulled strings, securing an invitation through a business associate. When the day arrived, he dressed in his finest suit, but for the first time, he felt like an outsider. The gala buzzed with conversation and laughter. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room, and servers glided between tables with trays of champagne. Daniel blended in seamlessly, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces while his eyes scanned the crowd. And then he saw her. Amelia stood near the stage, speaking with a group of donors. Her black gown hugged her figure, elegant yet understated. Her hair, styled in soft curls, framed her face perfectly. But it wasn't her appearance that made Daniel's breath catch. It was her presence. She looked unshakable, radiant in a way that made her seem untouchable. He hesitated, suddenly unsure of what he would even say. What right did he have to approach her after everything he had done? But before he could retreat, Amelia's eyes locked on his. For a moment, he saw recognition flicker across her face, followed by something harder to read. She excused herself from the group and walked toward him. "Daniel," she said, her tone measured but not unkind. "Amelia," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You look—" He stopped himself. Compliments felt hollow. "You look like you belong here." Her expression didn't change. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," he admitted. "To hear you speak." "Why?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth but couldn't find an answer that didn't sound selfish. "Because I had to," he said finally. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't walk away. "I saw the article about you," he added quickly, "about what you've built. It's incredible. You've done so much." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And now you want what? Closure? Redemption?" "No," he said, shaking his head. I needed to see for myself." "To see what?" "That you're okay." Her laughter was soft, almost bitter. "You thought I wouldn't be?" "No, that's not what I meant." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated at how wrong everything sounded. "I knew you'd be okay. I just didn't expect." She crossed her arms. "Didn't expect what? For me to succeed? To be happy without you?" "Amelia, that's not fair." "No, Daniel, what wasn't fair was what you did to me." Her voice was sharp now, but controlled. "You humiliated me. You tore me down in front of everyone I knew, and you walked away without a second thought." He flinched, but she wasn't finished. "You don't get to come here and act like you care. Not now, not after all this time." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Amelia raised a hand to stop him. "You're not here for me. You're here for yourself," she said. "You want me to tell you it's okay, that you're forgiven so you can stop feeling guilty. But I'm not here to make you feel better about what you did." Her words left him stunned. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, imagining her anger, maybe even tears, but he hadn't prepared for this, a calm, unwavering dismissal that left him feeling smaller than he ever had before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but that doesn't change anything." She turned to leave, but he couldn't let her go. Not yet. "Wait," he said, reaching for her arm. She pulled away. "Just tell me one thing," he said. "Did I push you to do this? To build all of this?" For the first time, her expression softened. "You were part of it," she admitted, "but not in the way you think. I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did it to prove myself right." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the crowd. Daniel spent the rest of the evening nursing a drink and watching Amelia from a distance. She moved through the room like someone who knew exactly where she belonged. And for the first time, Daniel felt what it was like to be the one left behind. Daniel couldn't shake the hollow ache that settled in his chest as he left the gala that night. He had imagined countless scenarios in his head, conversations where Amelia forgave him, where she acknowledged that he had been right to end things, or even moments where she confessed that she had never stopped thinking about him. But none of those fantasies had prepared him for reality. She had stood there, so composed and unshaken, her words cutting through him like glass. She had moved on. Not only had she moved on, but she had thrived. She no longer needed him or anyone, it seemed, to define her worth. The cold night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside, loosening his tie and trying to breathe. The streets buzzed with late-night traffic, but it all felt distant, muffled by the weight of what had just transpired. He felt adrift, as if something fundamental had been pulled out from under him. Days turned into weeks, but the encounter lingered in Daniel's mind. He tried to throw himself back into work, but deals that once excited him now felt empty. He sat through meetings, staring at spreadsheets and profit projections, and wondered if any of it really mattered. At night, he lay awake in his pristine penthouse, Rachel asleep beside him, while he stared at the ceiling and replayed Amelia's words over and over. You don't get to come here and act like you care. Not now. Not after all this time. It haunted him because it was true. Eventually, he couldn't resist reaching out again. He wrote draft after draft of an email, each one sounding more pathetic than the last. Finally, he settled on something simple. Amelia, I know I don't deserve another chance to speak with you, but I need to understand. Please. One more conversation. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Her response came 2 days later. Daniel, I don't owe you anything, but if you're looking for answers, meet me at the park on 7th Avenue tomorrow at 2 p.m. After that, we're done. He read it twice, his heart racing. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was something. The next day, he arrived early. The park was quiet, the bare trees casting long shadows across the pavement. He paced near the benches, hands in his pockets, checking his watch every few minutes. When Amelia finally appeared, she looked as composed as ever. Jeans, a tailored coat, and a scarf that framed her face. No makeup, no jewelry, and yet she carried herself with the same poise he'd seen at the gala. Thanks for coming, he said, standing as she approached. I don't have a lot of time, she replied, glancing at her watch. So say what you need to say. He gestured to the bench, and she reluctantly sat down, folding her hands in her lap. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. I guess I need to know how you did it, how you moved on. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You think it was easy? No, he said quickly, but you make it look that way. Her lips pressed together, and she looked out at the trees. It wasn't easy, Daniel. I fell apart after that day. I had nothing, no money, no job, no plan. I had to rebuild everything from scratch. He flinched at the words, but forced himself to keep looking at her. But here's the thing, she continued. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that moment at the altar. I remembered how small you made me feel, how worthless. And I told myself I would never let anyone make me feel that way again. Daniel swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you like that. But you did. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. He ran a hand through his hair. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought we were too different, that it wouldn't work. Amelia turned to face him, her eyes steady. And maybe you were right. Maybe we wouldn't have worked. But you didn't just end things, Daniel. You destroyed me. You made me a spectacle. And you let everyone in that room believe I wasn't good enough. Daniel looked down, ashamed. I was scared. Of what? Of losing control, of failing, of disappointing my parents. He exhaled, his voice breaking slightly. And I was a coward. Amelia stared at him for a long moment before speaking. I used to think I needed to hear you say that. I thought it would give me closure. But it doesn't. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had hoped that admitting his faults would change something, that it might soften her, but she wasn't here for his redemption. You asked how I moved on, she said, standing. I stopped needing your approval. That's how. Amelia, wait, he said, standing too. I know I can't change the past, but I'm not the same person I was back then. I've spent years trying to figure out what went wrong, and I see it now. I see what I did to you. She sighed, shaking her head. It's not about what you see, Daniel. It's about what I see. And right now, all I see is a man who's still trying to make this about him. He froze. You're not here because you care about me, she continued. You're here because you can't stand the thought that I'm better off without you. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm glad you're trying to change," she said finally, "but I don't need to be a part of that process." She turned and walked away, her steps steady and sure. Daniel watched her disappear down the path, his chest aching. He'd come here hoping for closure, for something to make the guilt go away. Instead, he was left with nothing but the harsh truth. He had lost her. Not just her love, but her respect. And this time, there was no way to get it back. Daniel sat alone in his office, the city skyline sprawling endlessly beyond the windows. The glass of whiskey on his desk sat untouched, a faint ring of condensation forming beneath it. Amelia's words from their final conversation echoed in his mind. "I don't need to be a part of that process." The truth of it lingered, heavy and undeniable. She had built a life without him, a life that thrived, and there was no room for him in it. For the first time, Daniel understood that closure wasn't something Amelia could give him. It was something he would have to find on his own. He turned his chair toward the window, letting his eyes drift across the skyline. The view, once a symbol of his success, now felt hollow. It wasn't enough anymore. Not the money, the power, or the polished image he had spent years crafting. None of it could fill the emptiness inside him. That night, he made a decision. The following morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, his assistant eyeing him curiously as he handed her a stack of papers. "Schedule meetings with these contacts," he said. "I want updates on their charity initiatives and partnerships." Her eyebrows lifted. "Charity initiatives? Sir, this isn't usually—" "Just do it," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and emails. By evening, Daniel had compiled a list of nonprofits and organizations focused on education and youth development. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, he poured himself into the project. He met with directors, attended fundraisers, and started writing checks, large ones. But it wasn't enough to just give money. He needed to be involved. At first, people treated him like just another wealthy donor, someone looking for good PR. But as Daniel showed up to meetings and volunteered his time, their attitudes began to shift. One afternoon, while visiting a local youth center, he noticed a boy sitting alone in the corner. The kid couldn't have been more than 10, but his eyes carried a weight far beyond his years. Daniel approached him cautiously. "Hey," he said, "what's your name?" The boy didn't answer, just stared at him with suspicion. Daniel sat down on the floor, keeping his distance. "You know, I used to sit just like that when I was a kid." The boy's eyes flickered with curiosity. "I didn't like talking to people much either," Daniel continued, "but I found out that sometimes if you let someone in, they can help you." The boy didn't respond, but when Daniel left that day, he felt something shift. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. As the months passed, his efforts grew. He helped fund scholarships, organized mentorship programs, and even started a foundation aimed at providing resources for underprivileged kids. But through it all, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. Amelia. She was a reason he had started down this path, even if she would never know it. One afternoon, while clearing his desk, Daniel found an envelope with no return address. His name was written in neat handwriting across the front. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding as he unfolded the note inside. "Daniel, I heard about what you're doing. It's good work. I hope you're doing it for the right reasons. Amelia." No apology, no invitation to reconnect. Just a few simple words that stirred something deep inside him. He read the note several times before slipping it back into the envelope and placing it in the drawer. It wasn't much, but it was enough. From that day on, Danell stopped looking for answers in the past. Instead, he focused on the present, on the people he could help, and the difference he could make. Meanwhile, Amelia continued to build her own legacy. Her organization expanded across the state, gaining national attention for its work. She remained committed to her mission, her life filled with purpose and meaning. Occasionally, she thought about Danell, not with anger or regret, but with quiet acceptance. He had been a chapter in her story, a painful but necessary part of her journey. One evening, as she sat in her office sorting through letters from women her organization had helped, she found herself smiling. She had done it. She had built something lasting, something no one could take away from her. And maybe, in some small way, Danell had been part of that. But her future was her own now, and as she turned off the lights and locked the door, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Danell, too, had finally made peace with the past. He no longer checked Amelia's social media or searched for her name online. Instead, he focused on his foundation, building something that mattered not for redemption, but because it was the right thing to do. He still thought of her sometimes, especially when he saw the kids his programs had helped. And though their paths had diverged, he knew her influence would always be a part of him. As he left his office one evening, he paused to watch the sunset. It painted the city in hues of gold and crimson, and for the first time in years, Danell felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Some stories don't end with perfect resolutions. Sometimes the people we hurt move on without us, and sometimes we have to let them. But every ending is also a beginning. And Danell and Amelia, though no longer walking the same path, had both found their own way forward. Thank you for following this story to the end. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know if you believe in second chances or if moving on is the only way. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dive deep into life's turning points.